Hello and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. My name is Kevin Castley, and this is another episode of Hawk Talk with Kevin Castley, the interview program where I interview fellow people who share similar views regarding foreign policy. And we get to know a bit about our guests and kind of see the experiences and whatnot that leads people to come to similar conclusions about the West and the West role in the world in terms of international relations, security, and human rights. So today we are joined by Elias here. And Elias and I, we've known each other for quite a while now. And we'll get to that a little bit later on in the interview. But, we kind of met through a meme page that I created. And you can go and check that out too. We'll have a link down in the Chiron pretty soon, but thank you to those of you who are with us tonight. We're going to go here to Elias. Thanks for coming on, and if you could just kind of let the people know a couple things about you, and so we can get to know you, I'd appreciate that.
Well, thanks for having me, Kevin. My name's Elias, like you probably see on the screen there. I've been in contact with Kevin for, I'd say, about a year and a half now. I got into this particular brand of politics in force, I think, in the aftermath of the 2016 election, in which you saw this massive upswing in populism, and at the same time you saw this surge in nationalism and isolationism coming from left and right. And I think what it really highlighted is that in order for the liberal world that we know so well to thrive, it's critical to have, functional center left and center right branches within the United States electorate and within its government willing for the United States to take an active role in the world. And
yeah,
I think what really drove that point home was you saw, in the years following the September 11 attacks, in the years following that, you initially had this massive upswell in people who thought that the United States should take an active role in the world, largely as a reaction to that. But you also saw it, with the Great Recession a few years later, you saw a lot of that wane. And I think it's nonetheless something that should be actively striven to we should actively strive to keep that strain alive.
Yeah. Oh man, absolutely. Absolutely. That's really the sort of thing that the upsurge in populism really acted to really fight against, because you can say, well, populists, they can waver on economics, they can waver on social issues to some extent, but it really is the isolationism that's really the uniting factor between left-wing and right-wing populists. There's that idea that we should stick our heads in the sand, pretend the world doesn't exist. And if you disagree with that, you're working with, and they'll use anti-Semitic slurs oftentimes. That's another common uniting factor in populism by and large. The thing is, though, you talked about 9/11 is really like one of the moments that really kind of kicked off a lot of the mainstream idea, at least in this century, right? That America and the West needs to have a more active role in the world from a security standpoint and whatnot, and that kind of went away in 2016. Like, one of the purposes of this channel here is to try to get back to that understanding that the way that you prevent these things and the way that you build a more secure world is by taking part in that world in a proactive manner. And what you had also mentioned there was that you guys got interested in 2016 and whatnot, and kind of went in this direction. It is interesting because a lot of people around that time, a lot of people that I've known, a lot of people that might have been former, for example, George W. Bush supporters that were hawkish, became isolationists around that time. You went in the opposite direction, obviously. Like, I've kind of gone in the opposite direction. Like, I think for both of us, probably, that we've always kind of had that sort of sense of the need for a presence in the world and a response. I mean, I know 9/11 for me was like really the first historical event that I can remember. And so I've always kind of been hawkish, but I didn't really put it into really concrete political terms until much later in life. Obviously, I was like a kid back then. But for you though, I got a question which I try to ask all the guests here, which is that, when it comes to hawks, we have a diversity of political ideologies, but share more or less a similar understanding on international relations. What sort of term would you identify with your views of foreign policy? Would you call yourself like a hawk, a neoconservative, a liberal internationalist? What sort of term would you in particular apply to your
I
view?
think to some extent they all can be a little interchangeable. I don't think I quite fall into the same, tradition that, say, Reagan or Bush would, because alongside
Hmm.
the label neoconservatism, it every once in a while comes with also the social conservative aspects. And
Right.
I mean, it's not a complete 50, or excuse me, a complete 1-to-1 interchangeability rate. But if I had to pick one of the three, I would probably say a liberal internationalist,
Gotcha.
because when we talk about liberalism in the United States, it tends to get a little muddled what that term means, because you have everyone from, you have the Milton Friedman-esque libertarian types who like to refer to themselves as classical liberals, for example. But when you say liberal, that is a term in the United States that can be used to encompass everyone from Bernie Sanders to Joe Mnuchin. But when you
Yeah.
apply it more broadly, I mean, I've got my own thoughts about using the term liberal to describe Bernie Sanders, but that's beside the point for a moment. The term liberal has become interchangeable with the word progressive, and I think there is a lot of overlap there. But when you go back to the roots of what liberalism was in the 1840s, with the revolutions of 1848 in Germany and across Europe, what liberalism was born as was this, semi-free market economic plan coupled with opposition to the monarchies that dominated Europe at the time. And I think you
Hmm.
can translate that monarchism to some extent, not again, not 1-to-1, but you can translate that opposition to monarchism as an opposition to authoritarianism in general, not to the point where it's full-fledged anarchism, but nonetheless to the point where you have a reasonable compromise between the responsibilities of government and the responsibilities of the people, or I should say the rights of the people.
Right.
And I think
Right.
that,
Right.
particularly in the United States, there tends to be this habit that liberalism only applies, again, to the United States. This has become something that's been a lot more popular in, the aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, where liberalism is something that applies strictly to the United States. We don't, a lot of liberals are a lot more willing to, or self-described liberals in the United States are a lot more willing to back down from this, I guess you would call it an interchange between the rights and responsibilities of government and people abroad, and a lot more willing to engage in democracy that may or may not, or excuse me, not democracy, in diplomacy, three-letter word that starts with a D, excuse me, that um, ends up a lot of time aiding and abetting hostile regimes abroad.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting earlier on in the interview you had mentioned that what we would like to see basically is a return to a prominent center left, a center right that shares that understanding on foreign policy, and I think it's interesting that you noted that there, because some would classify people like Joe Biden, for example, or Ronald Reagan, or these types of people that we would probably think of as like, within that spectrum, that's sort to the center. They would call them, far right, for example, like the Kyle Kalinskis and those types of people. They would see
Mhm.
Joe Biden as basically a far right Republican. Yet, what this era, 2016 and on, has shown us is that there is a much further right than people like George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, and
Oh,
that's
certainly, certainly.
staunch isolationism, very staunch isolationism, and that's the key part of it. Usually, it's coupled with social conservatism as well, and then on the left, you have like the Corbyn type figures, or that go beyond Bernie Sanders. They go to outright socialism, and there it's as well just as isolationist. And so it's important that you highlighted that sort of centrist spectrum, at least there, because a lot of people see spectra or centrism now as a boomer thing or something that's bad. They think of
Hmm.
centrism as a bad thing, and that you're right that there's a huge difference between somebody on the center left, like an Elizabeth Warren type figure, or somebody like David Packman, and somebody
Hmm.
who's like on the center right, like a Mitt Romney type figure, right? Yet
Hmm.
by and large, those types of figures generally, they'll vary even on foreign policy, but they'll generally see America as something that is a good thing in the world by and large.
Hmm.
Of course, Elizabeth Warren, that gets complicated because she has some isolationist tendencies, but the
Hmm.
far right and the far left, they see America as a bad thing. And you can see it with Twitter, where they say, the far right would say, well, I'd rather be on Russia's side than America's side. They don't even want to try to make America more conservative. They've given up on America, and they say we'll side with the enemy now. They're not
Hmm.
like Reagan in that sense. They're like, well, screw America. Let's go and join the KGB or whatever. And then you have the people on the far left who say, yeah, we're done with America. We want a revolution. We want to make it a communist state or whatever. And so when you highlight that sort of centrist sort of spectrum, I think that's important because a lot of people think of centrism and they associate it with corporatism. But what you should really associate that centrist spectrum with is an understanding that America is a good actor. That's really the dividing line, is how people view America. Like yourself and
Hmm.
myself, we view America as, as basically a net positive, something that should be preserved. And
Hmm.
people outside that spectrum almost universally see America as something that either needs to be completely redone in their own image or just done away with and taken over by a foreign power. And for to get on to kind of the next question here about that, would you
Hmm.
kind of consider yourself then within that spectrum to be more center right, centrist, or center left?
You know, I like to joke that it kind of depends on the day with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to, economic affairs, I think it's been a pretty uniting thing that we tend to be a little bit more, the liberal hawk, internationalist, however you choose to term it, community tends to be generally more right wing when it comes to economics, and I that's not something I radically break from. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of I know this has become a little bit of a curse word on the channel, but a lot of people who consider themselves neoliberals are are nonetheless open to the ideas of free trade and the idea that you should allow capitalism to proceed. But where I think I break from that traditional sense is that you cannot leave capitalism completely to go unfettered, and you also cannot leave yourself completely without restriction when it comes to trade with, say, China. That's been a huge one that's been in the news as of recently, and arguably for the last, what is
Yeah.
it now, 4 or 5 decades? Because
Yeah.
China has what happened to China was, in the aftermath of Mao Zedong, they had reformers like Deng Xiaoping come in, and while they liberalized the economy and moved it away from that radical Maoist standpoint, they did not allow for a whole lot in the way of human rights reforms. You did not have, excuse me for a moment,
Oh
you
yeah.
did not have an actual socially liberal component come alongside that. So, you know, as much as Mao's human rights abuses get brought up, we tend to overlook the fact that the Tiananmen Square massacre happened under Deng Xiaoping, and he is nonetheless considered a reformer. But I think what happened is that the world sort of figured that that was good enough, that China could remain politically and socially illiberal so long as they were economically liberal and allowing to supply goods and services to the United States and the rest of the world at
Mhm.
a low price. And we just never really got into the idea of breaking them of that. And I think you still see it to this day under Xi Jinping. There are still
Yeah.
elements, absolutely, that are putting pressure on Xi Jinping's regime, both from within and without. But nonetheless, that idea that economics becomes all that sort of dominates right-wing politics, either going from the center outwards, I think it nonetheless can be a harmful force. And I absolutely break with the right wing when it comes to social issues.
Yeah.
For instance.
No, as do I. Yeah. Yeah, you talked about how with neoconservatism, for example, that there's generally that association with social conservative values, and for me, like on Twitter, I've usually gone by the liberal neocon because I believe in liberal economics and liberal social issues,
Mhm,
but I'm a neocon when it comes to foreign policy and economics, and the big part there is that yes, I'm a liberal on economics, except for me, I make the distinction that the military is a very important investment, and security is a very worthwhile expenditure. And
mhm,
in an ideal world, we could spend very little on defense and focus on other things once the world is a democracy or a federation of democracies. But
mhm,
until then, you have to have a very strong investment in defense and research and development to keep a leg up over your opponents. And
mhm,
the other aspect, which I think that we would agree on, is that when it comes to things like free trade and when it comes to international economics, free trade in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it needs to be guided by a moral compass. You can't just do free trade with anybody that offers to do it with you,
oh,
and that's
absolutely.
that's where we break from the neoliberals, because the neoliberals would say, well, it's okay that communist China is still communist and they're still radically conservative and opposed to us, because they'll
Mhm,
sell us cheap stuff. Whereas for neoconservatives put morals over money and say we'd rather uphold the Western order, even if it doesn't make us as much money or if it costs us money, than the neoliberals who say, well, human rights for the West, and then to hell with everybody else, as long as they trade with us, essentially. And some neoliberals, I think, misguidedly, genuinely believe that if we just trade with Beijing enough, that will magically make them a democracy, and as if it were somehow influenced by like the understanding as of somebody like Jean Kirkpatrick, because Jean Kirkpatrick believed that having military alliances and supporting dictatorships but that were aligned with America was a good thing, and she did believe that would make them democratic. But she was key there, that she said it's dependent on two things. One, you basically have to defeat the enemy first, the Soviet Union, and two, once that's done, you have to use your leverage to apply pressure on them. But as we've seen, the neoliberal sort of establishment never bothered to apply pressure on Beijing, and that includes Republicans and Democrats, unfortunately. And I think
mhm.
this is something we should get into a little bit more because of the pandemic going on. Everybody's thinking about it and whatnot. But I didn't have this pre-planned to ask you, but I'm kind of curious now. What would your sort of solution be to deal with Beijing right now in light of this pandemic that they allowed to fester and covered up and arrested Dr. Lee over and basically brought it upon the world? What do you think should be the appropriate response?
Well, as it stands right now, there are really no easy answers when it comes to China. I mean, China is a very special case when it comes to this sort of thing. They have the largest population in the world. They're on course to be outpaced by India, but as it stands right now, they have triple the population of the United States. And the biggest factor when it comes to difficulties in taking on China, well, I actually should stack on two here, is one, a they are a nuclear armed power, so they do have quite a capacity to hit back. And two, there is no easy way to divest from them economically that doesn't put a massive hit on the American wallet. And I mean that at every
Mhm.
level from the CEO down to the consumer. But that aside, you cannot allow China to go completely unpunished for not only its decades upon decades of human rights abuses, for its authoritarianism and hiding secrets from the world, the COVID pandemic being a part of that. I think one of the things that would help a lot is you start moving manufacturing out of China and start moving it into Southeast Asia or South Asia proper. You know,
Yeah,
Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, India.
India.
I'm notably passing over Myanmar here because I have no faith in the regime that currently controls Myanmar, but I think
Yeah,
that there's a lot of room for progress when it comes to the rest of Southeast Asia and the rest of South Asia. That despite my personal misgivings about a lot of the human rights situations and a lot of the political situations down there, it is a lot easier to put leverage on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos than it is to put leverage on communist China with its 1.2 billion people and God knows how many nuclear weapons. So if you start moving industry out of China and into more friendly, more
right.
democratic areas, that is a great way to kick the legs out from under the CCP and not have to pay a whole lot of bloodshed in the process to do it.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, for sure. I think, on this channel we talked a lot about China, and I think, by and large we have a similar view on these things. I've gone so far as to advocate here though that we as the West, or at least the United States, go and do a full blockade on the country until the communist system goes bankrupt and collapses and
Mhm.
is replaced by something more democratic. What do you think about actively enforcing a blockade in addition to substituting the manufacturing to other countries? Do you think that
I
that
can tell you
would
I would
probably go
not be
too far?
opposed to the idea.
Gotcha.
Be it
Because
either an economic blockade or be it a hard power blockade, we do have allies in the region who would be willing to support us either way. You know, Taiwan, the
yeah,
Republic of China, or South Korea or India, which has a tenuous relationship with China to the point where they can see them either as a partner or as a geopolitical ally, or excuse me, as a partner or as a geopolitical adversary, depending on what issue it is we're talking about in particular. And I think that there are
right.
elements within China itself that would be willing to resist the CCP either passively or actively. I mean, we've already seen resistance to the CCP coming out of Hong Kong, and not just the recent movement that has admittedly petered out a lot given the COVID outbreak, but you have
Hmm.
seen resistance from the Falun Gong, you have seen resistance from Xinjiang, you have seen resistance from Tibet.
Yeah.
The Chinese Communist Party does not exactly have the greatest reputation when you're talking about those particular areas, especially given the massive human rights abuses that have been taking place since Mao Zedong and before.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's the sort of thing that when it comes to this, I think a lot of people are finally waking up. They're finally waking up to the fact that we probably should have taken more stringent action uh, to modernize and liberalize China after the Cold War was over, because for the longest time it was just kind of taken as the default status quo that, well, we trade with China, we borrow from China, and without really thinking about it too much, that they are a perfect storm of both very unsanitary practices coupled with a political culture where cover up is the only way that you can survive and
Oh,
and
absolutely.
not go to a gulag.
And to piggyback off of that, I think that we had similar misgivings about Russia. You know, because something very similar happened in Russia, except Russia admittedly went the other way when it comes to economic development. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, and this goes back to something we were talking about a little earlier, capitalism outpaced democracy in Russia. You had all
Yeah.
these state assets that were being let go, being bought up by oligarchs. You had a president who spent more time, honestly, if I'm being completely candid, drunk off his ass than legislating. You had the standard issue political turmoil that comes with the collapse of a world power, the constitutional crisis in 93, where coup forces were trying to shell the White House in Russia.
Yeah.
And I think that we just sort of thought, well, Russia's economically liberalized now. They're no longer communist. Thus, everything else will just sort of fall into place over time. And you didn't get that. You got a lot of Russians who were disaffected after the Soviet Union's collapse, and a lot of them who were hungry for that authoritarianism, which, while brutal, whether it worked or not, they saw it as a functional system because it was all that they'd ever known, and every prosperity and every failure had nonetheless been under that authoritarianism. And the fact that under
Right.
liberalism, things just kept sliding. Well, I think you get where I'm going. It goes back to, Vladimir Putin coming to power then in the aftermath of this crisis, and even through the Putin administration up until I would say about 2014, 2013 and 14, when the Ukrainian Revolution kicked off and Russian forces moved into Crimea and Donbass, you still nonetheless
Yeah.
had this overriding sentiment that, well, Russia's economically liberalized now, which means that we still have some room and things can fall into place. We can make them our ally with no additional pressure on their human rights situation.
Yeah. No, I will say just at this point in the interview, just to those of you watching right now, we've still got 13 viewers with us. Thank you for being here. If you have any questions about foreign policy, international relations, and whatnot for Elias here, we will be doing a question and answer segment at the end. So don't post your questions currently because there'll be a long chat log. But if you could think of them, bear that in mind, and then we will go to you later on to for any sort of questions. And I'm going to move on to the next question that I had for you. I had written this out, but you did kind of answer a decent amount of it in the opening part of the interview. But what sort of experiences and knowledge generally led you to come to that to come to a hawkish perspective? I know a number of people would say it was things like, the idea of seeing dictatorships or 9/11, that sort of stuff. You mentioned 2016 was around when you really kind of went in that direction, but what sort of events or knowledge kind of really kicked that off for you?
Well, truth be told, it's something that I've been sympathetic to ever since I very first started getting interested in politics when the Obama administration was first getting elected. I mean, obviously, I was not politically mature at the time, and obviously, I've still got growing to do. Everyone does. But I think what really drove home the point for me, it was twofold. First thing was the rise of ISIL in 2013 to 14 amidst the Syrian civil war. And in 2014, I got really into following that war because that was when ISIL started emerging from the more radical elements present in Syria. That was when their invasion of Iraq took place and Mosul fell. And the second one was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So when I talk about Syria, I mean, I was following Twitter updates on this war, getting information from wherever I could. And I remember two things at that point. The focus was off Assad at that point in the war for a lot of Western media, and it was a lot more on ISIL. So with ISIL now at the gates of Baghdad, I realized that, the Iraqi government cannot do this itself. They are going to need the support of the United States in order to beat back this threat. And I also remember thinking at that same time, how did we let this happen? Because in 2011, when the Obama administration pulled all of our troops out of Iraq, everyone from the president all the way down to the actual troops fighting, thought, well, this is the end. It's over. And I know there was a lot of dissent about that in more hawkish circles, but nonetheless, the political victory was won. And so in
Hmm.
2011, you had this mission accomplished sort of sense. And not 3 years later, you have those exact same insurgents who had just spent the past, what would it have been, 11 years, over a decade fighting, now getting ready to storm Iraq's capital city. I remember seeing things on Time magazine. I remember a cover they ran on Time about the end of Iraq as a nation state, how it would, you know, probably be overrun by ISIL in the northwest, how you would have holdouts, Shia holdouts in the southeast, and how Kurdistan would probably end up breaking off it. I still think that might happen. I admittedly don't think it'll be ISIL running the northwest. But the point is, I remember being so disillusioned with Obama's very diplomatic and idealistic way of dealing with things at that point. Because in 2013 and 14, or excuse me, I should say in that period between 2011 and 2014, Iraq was a complete sideshow to Iraq, to Syria and to Libya.
Yeah.
And when you suddenly had this well organized, broadly popularly supported in the Northwest Islamist insurgency come out, it laid bare the entire idea of, well, we'll just back off and then the Iraqis can handle it themselves. Iraq was in no place ready to handle that when it was all said and done. And when we go to talk about Russia with the invasion of Ukraine that happened roughly in that same time frame, you know, they had just invaded Georgia in the Caucasus not 5 years before that, and
Hmm.
set up these two other states, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So when Russian troops started moving into Ukraine in the aftermath of the revolution, and they occupied Crimea, they started showing up alongside the insurgents present in Luhansk and Donetsk. I got this sense that, well, the next place this could happen could be in somewhere officially NATO aligned, because the Russians don't fight fair, they never have,
Yeah.
but they have started implementing this way of warfare to push back on the democratic world that is a lot more covert than anything we had previously expected to encounter. I mean, a lot of times when we talk about a geopolitical confrontation with Russia, what we like to think about is American Abrams tanks staring down Russian T-90s somewhere in Poland. And if it came to that, the United States would win overwhelmingly, and Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, and everyone else in the Russian government knows that fact.
Yeah.
So what they do instead is they will, sort of claw at the fringes of where NATO is in Georgia and in Ukraine. And the only way to push back on that is actively. You cannot passively counter the Russian threat, be it through the so-called troll farms they used to push populists in the 2016 election, be it through the armed insurgents they sent into Donetsk and Luhansk.
Right. Right. Well, I think when it comes to those flashpoints that you mentioned specifically, I mean, those are really some of the biggest pills right there, because if you are somebody who, let's say you're on the right or something, and you identify more with Nick Fuentes and Steve Bannon and these types of people, and you call yourself like an America First or whatever,
Mhm.
there is really no way that you're upholding American security by pretending that these flashpoints aren't a problem, by saying that you shouldn't have an involvement there. Because you're
Mhm.
right, what Russia does is they recognize the overwhelming hard power strength of NATO, and so they try to rile up and gain ground on the fringes, as well as use the sort of psyop type techniques. We'll get into the meme stuff a bit later, but that sort of
Mhm.
stuff, because that's all that they've been relegated to. And they know that they couldn't win a conventional war, but what they can win is they can win the battle for political will. And it
Hmm.
starts off with the fringes of NATO. Right now, the fringes of NATO are, as you mentioned, Eastern Ukraine, Ukraine itself, Georgia, those sorts of areas. But if they get victories there unchallenged and nothing really comes of it, then of course we know that they'll go on. And like I say, you give a dictator an inch, he'll take a mile. You give him a further inch, he'll take 1,000 miles.
Hmm.
They'll then the fringes will eventually be in Germany and so on and so forth. And I think the big one is if they go into a NATO country like Estonia, which Putin wants to do, or Poland, which Putin wants to do,
Hmm.
and they're unchallenged then by the United States because the United States political culture says we're bad and we're America first. Let's let our standing in the world be completely overrun by our enemy.
Hmm.
Well, then they're just going to keep taking more and more ground. And there's no way that you wind up in a more secure position by doing that. I mean, as John Bolton said, war is inevitable. It's better to fight a war over there than on our own shores. And those are your two choices, basically, and he's right about that if you just hand Eurasia over to the enemies, then they won't be they will not be satisfied with Eurasia for that long. They'll eventually come for the Americas. And so
Oh,
even if you
absolutely.
were an isolationist, that's the thing. Even if these people, and I'll have a video out pretty soon on how to hawk pill conservatives, but even if you don't care about the human rights or anything out there, you just care about American security. From an American security standpoint, you're worse off having to fight a war in New York State and California than you are in Georgia and Ukraine, basically. And and
Hmm.
and those are the choices if you let them gain ground. And because Putin and all these people that they shill for and admire are not isolationists; they're expansionists to the core. They seek to control Eurasia and eventually the world. And it's the sort of thing that when it comes to this sort of situation, that kind of leads me to the next question here, which is uh, we basically met through and came to know each other through my meme page, Liberal Hawk Memes for Moral Universalist Teens, and a lot of the memes
Hmm.
kind of deal with this kind of stuff. And what I
Hmm.
want to get your opinion on is, what do you think about the role of memetics in the political culture? In terms of international relations and stuff.
Well, if I'm speaking in a completely candid manner, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think on one hand, they are exceptionally potent for a variety of causes, be those, spreading your own opinions about uh, any given issue. And that can be for better or for worse. I mean, on one hand, you've got the kind of stuff that you're doing, which is, well, in support of that, liberal internationalist train of thought. And at the same time, I think if you really want to see them as an effective weapon, you take a look into what the radical right wing and left wing campaigns were doing from 2015 onwards. If you talk to a lot of, Nick Fuentes kind of guys, or, Proud Boys. I don't want to use the term militants because that is too strong a term for what they are. They're LARPers. But nonetheless, you're going to find a lot of them who reach that level of radicalization through memes. But nonetheless, by that token, I think that if applied properly in the opposite direction, you can de radicalize a lot of people that way. And you can push them towards a train of thought that is a lot more, uh, well, certainly less radical, but nonetheless more open to democracy as well. I
Right.
think you can use it as a way of pushing a worldview that is a lot more, I guess, globally centered. I mean, you tell the story through someone else's eyes, and it makes it a lot more real, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when it comes to that sort of stuff, I mean, obviously, memes were really potent in terms of radicalizing people on the far right and the far left, and what I've generally seen is that when it comes to the center specifically, or when it comes to hawks and whatnot, it's changing now, of course, I hope to be on the forefront of that with my meme page. But it's not really been as strong a game when it comes to memetics. I mean, I really like people like Bill Crystal and stuff, but by and
Mhm.
large, they have their YouTube programs where they do interviews with like honestly really brilliant academics and stuff. But then you're like, and they write really good papers on foreign policy and stuff and books. But then you're like, yeah, but the average audience here is probably like 45, and it's mostly
Mhm.
people that already agree with them. And you're like, this isn't really going to work to pill millennials or to pill Zoomers and stuff.
Yeah,
I
because you're
and I
not
think
you're
that
not really connecting with a new audience in that.
that's the problem is it's like I fully understand, and I've had the point made to me on many times that yeah, but the people that read their papers are the people with the hands of power in Washington, and I understand that, but the problem is the electorate, the opinions of the electorate do matter at the end of the day. And
Mhm.
as much as you might have think tanks and people in positions of power in DC that are already pilled and do understand this stuff, they
Mhm.
can very easily find themselves without a job if a populist comes into office or something. And I think that
Oh, absolutely.
the anti-populist, the interventionists, people like this really neglected the meme sphere, neglected potent approaches to politics in favor of really a 1990s or prior style of politics, kind of like a Joe
Mhm.
Biden style. I like those guys, but I can see why a lot of younger people are they're not really engaged by it. They want something edgier or more potent and stuff like that. And so we're slowly changing it. We're slowly changing it. But I
Mhm.
saw the meme. You made a meme very recently. I'm just going to get the meme here. I won't be able to put it up on the screen, but I'm going to try to find it. You could speak to the meme a little bit. I'm just going to go to my meme page here because you
Are
had
we
a
talking
really
about
good
the one with the Baptist?
you with the Ba'athist. That's right. You can even talk about it. That's right. The one with the Ba'athist is so great because it's like uh it is, yeah. Which one is it? I got a lot of memes here, but the one that you had was so good. It was talking about how like there's the typical Zoomer dude. It was in the style of the Burr memes, and it was like the Ba'athist was basically saying, no, we blend. Yeah, here it is. I got it up here. It's if you could see it it's kind of hard to see. This is the actual meme right here. Kind of, yeah, it's kind of see, but you can find it on the meme page. The Zoomer says, "No, you can't just call me a fascist. I'm a Ba'athist. We blend traditional nationalism together with socialist economic ideals, so we can resist the international capitalist system and the Zionisterinos. It's not fascism; it's anti-imperialism with Arab characteristicerinos. No." And then you've got a dude. You got a guy who's like got a long beard. He kind of looks like the Duck Dynasty guys. He's got an American flag bandana. He just says "fucking fascist." I love that. I love that. If you could speak to that meme a bit, there's so much going on there. And I like that you changed up the tie on the guy because a lot of people who do those, they just keep the same Ancapistan bow tie from the original Burr meme about the
Mhm.
monetary policy, but you actually changed it to the Ba'athist party flag, and I like that. I like the attention to detail. I like it. I like it. You got some potent memes, man.
Well, I
Oh
mean that
man.
that particularly came out of dealing with a lot, and I mean just an ungodly amount of Twitter Bathists who, from the comfort of Brooklyn and San Jose, will condemn this supposed American imperialism and just completely ignoring uh, the Assad regime's war crimes. And they have this whole thing about how Baathism is this special, unique, uh, anti-imperialist brand of socialism, and no, it's fascism. When you cut away all the fat, it's not particularly distinguishable from what Hitler and Mussolini were hawking back in the day. I'm sorry to break it to you, shoe on head, partisan girl. You're fascists.
Oh, you
I
just
don't
called
I don't
out
like
Jews.
you.
You just called out June. Oh man, dude. A lot of the fans of this channel and stuff are familiar with June's work. Reese of Nightmare Fuel. He is a kind of exposed June to. June personally got very triggered by me on Twitter because I had posted I forget exactly what it was. It was like basically like I'm Reagan on economics, I'm Hillary Clinton on social issues, and I'm George W. Bush on foreign policy. And this triggered the hell out of her when she saw the post. So she just responded to it like liberal neocon. Like she got triggered. And so I responded to her with a meme that Kraut. Everybody go subscribe to Kraut on YouTube. He's a great content creator. He's got a really interesting video on Turkey that you can go and check out. Great animations. He draws a lot of country balls. He's at I Draw Balls on Twitter. If you go check him out, he's a pretty cool guy. But he made a meme and it was just June looking like a brainlet, basically. And so I captioned it with "We're bad," and I had a few exclamation marks in there. And I sent that to her, and she was like, "I'm logging off of Twitter. I'm done. I'm done." And all of her fans ratioed me or whatever. And it's like, yeah, if one hawk gets ratioed by 10,000 pigeons, does that mean that you'd rather be a pigeon or a hawk? No, like one hawk can take 10,000 pigeons. A hawk can eat 10,000 pigeons for breakfast. Like of course I'd rather be the hawk.
Well, I mean, maybe over the course of
Of course I'd rather be the hawk. Well, for sure. It depends how hungry the hawk is on that day. Like, if you're hungry for some dank memes, I got in the Chiron. If you're hungry for some dank memes, go check out the meme page. But yeah, no, she got triggered. Yeah, June, I love how you point that out because it's like she would argue, no, I'm a democratic socialist, bro. We're not fascists. We just defend fascist regimes. We're not actually fascists. It's like, but of course you make that point that at the end of the day, if you're going to defend these brutal tyrannies, if you're going to defend like the Republic of Fear in Iraq, if you're going to pretend or defend rather chemical experimentation, gassing, mass gulags, labor camps, concentration camps in North Korea, all that sort of stuff in the name of anti-imperialism, it's like no, you are fascist. You're a lot closer to Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin than you are to somebody like, for example, Hillary Clinton or Joe Lieberman, Mitt Romney, any of those sorts of figures. I mean, people talk about horseshoe theory and stuff, and the left, the right, they'll always say how it's like, that's just a meme. That's not real, bro, because they don't want to think of themselves as being close to the degenerates on the left or the fascists on the right, depending on which perspective you are. But I love the catchphrase that you use, because when you see stuff that really kind of highlights how horseshoe theory is real, these brainlet takes, you comment, you're like, man, this really shoes my horse. And I love that. I love that line, man. That's a classic. That's an absolute classic. So, like, did you come up with that shoes my horse? Because that's some top tier stuff, man.
Well, I stole it sort of from something else, but I mean, you can find that similar sort of comment all over the place. I think I might have been the first one to put that spin on it, but I can't take
it's so good. It's so good. It shoes your horse. It shoes your horse. It's just that needs to be a new figure of speech, because there's so many brainlet takes on Twitter lately of Bernie bros defending Trump and saying how they'll vote for Trump over Joe Biden and all this stuff. And that's the class that's your go-to response to everybody who's watching this. Just say, oh yeah, that really shoes my horse. Don't even really get into it with them. I mean, it's not like you're going to change their mind. They're already so radical. They think that like Assad is cool, and it was just like a Jewish conspiracy to try to say that he killed people or whatever, and all this stuff. It's like total mess. But we are going to get to the next
on a more serious note there. I think that what it really takes to defend the likes of Bashar al-Assad or Nicolas Maduro or Kim Jong-un or anyone from this left-wing perspective is it takes a couple things. It takes an overwhelming sense of contrarianism, a complete lack of self-awareness, and a complete lack of empathy. And the latter of those two in particular are something that a lot of people on the left like to pride themselves on having more than they do on the right. Let's take an example for a little while. If you say that you're against the concept of a fully nationalized healthcare system in a room full of these rose Twitter type personalities, you're
Yeah.
going to get immediately a lot of accusations that you want to kill the poor people. You've got no sympathy, no empathy for anyone who might be struggling. And then by the same token, you will find a lot of those same rose Twitter handles not 5 minutes later condemning the United States for even the slightest bit of action against, sorry, am I a little too low here?
Oh, yeah,
Against Bashar
yeah,
al-Assad.
I was just highlighting a comment. I just wanted to highlight an interesting comment from the chat, but then it kind of covered up your face. It's just Anapode Actual says Shoe on Head is just monetizing the socialists out there. In other words, she's a grifty grifter, and I think we would probably both agree with that, right? Oh man, yeah, no, that's better. That's better. Yeah.
All right. Sorry, I just didn't want to be like down here again. So,
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. But yeah, as you were saying.
but like I said, you'll find a lot of people who will condemn people who are anywhere right of that position, even others on the center left and that left wing side of the spectrum who may not completely agree with the concept of a fully nationalized healthcare system for any number of reasons. I'm not going to talk about the rationale or reasonability, because that's a whole conversation for another time. But you will have them condemn people who do not support that position for their lack of empathy and lack of sympathy, and at the same time then flip around and condemn a genocidal mass murderer like Bashar al-Assad, Slobodan Milosevic,
Yeah.
any character from the past, I would say, half century who has been murderous and monstrous and authoritarian, but so long as they weren't on the United States' side of things, we're completely fine. And it's this overwhelming
Yeah.
sense of contrarianism that has come to dominate left-wing politics. And I'm not talking about Elizabeth Warren necessarily in that sense, but I'm more talking
Right.
about, Bernie Sanders and his, well, Fidel Castro may have been a murderer, but he had a great literacy program, right?
The books. Hey man, the kids, they learn how to read. They learn how to read the Communist Manifesto. Can you really say it wasn't worth it? Can you really say it wasn't worth it? Hey, Bernie Sanders, what did he say about Castro? He said, for me personally, the Cuban Revolution is very deep. It's a very deep revolution. That's what he said.
Yeah,
That's what
very,
he said.
very
And
deep.
I'm like, the only thing deep about that revolution were the mass graves. What an absolute fun. I'm so glad he got
Those
routed,
mass
and
killings and work camps are just so complex.
I'm just so glad that he got curb stomped like Corbyn as well.
Mhm,
It's so great to see these people come to terms with the fact that they're completely politically irrelevant. It's just
mhm,
it's the sort of thing, you mentioned there about how these people that claim to freak out that you don't care about people that are struggling or whatever if you aren't for things like Medicare for all, which is a pretty radical idea, for example, but that no other country has even anywhere near an equivalent to it. Not Canada, not Western Europe, not Scandinavia. It's far more socialist than that, far more
mhm,
left wing than that. But as far as when you bring up people that are really struggling, like people getting gassed by Saddam or people getting genocided over in the former Yugoslavia, for example, they don't care.
mhm,
They don't care. They'll say, well, that's their culture or that's their sphere of influence or whatever. Who are we to say anything? That's his sovereignty, bro. That's Saddam's country. He can
mhm,
do what he wants. And it's like, so they are perfectly happy to side with the elite and to side with the powerful against the oppressed in those contexts. But then in America, they claim to be like anti-establishment or whatever, but they love every other establishment beyond America's borders. And it's funny to
mhm,
me. And what it really highlights is that to them, they have such a limited knowledge and such a limited concern for the rest of the world and don't really know of anything outside of America that for them having to work a job at McDonald's or not being able to get like a Lamborghini or something is like the worst atrocity that's ever been perpetrated in the history of mankind. And
Mhm.
the biggest issue in the world is that they have to pay like an extra couple $100 a month for like healthcare insurance, which by the way, I got news. If you went over to a system like Bernie wants, you'd have to pay that money, but in taxes. So it's not that much of a difference.
It
And you
balances out, guys.
and that's the thing, and so they don't really care. And you mentioned earlier on in this interview that those people on the fringe and cringe people, they don't have any empathy. They truly don't care. And you'll see now when I go into these meme groups and I go into these cesspools and see them where they've taken the mask off now that they've lost and they're honest. They don't care. They really don't care. They're like they'll say, well, those people deserve to die, or Stalin did nothing wrong, we should learn from Stalin. That's what somebody like Guantanamo Bay, woke Bay Hassan Piker would say, for example, advocating for shooting landlords, that sort of stuff in America. These people, they don't care. And when it comes down to it, that's another defining line between the center left to the center right versus the fringes, is that those within the spectrum of normalcy do care. We disagree on the best way to make society more prosperous or more secure, but we care about doing so. Whereas these people, the dirtbag left, the ultra conservative right, these people, they genuinely don't care. They just want to burn everything down to spite the boomers. They want to burn their own house to own the neocons. It's hilarious to me. And what's unfortunate right now, especially on a platform like this, like right now we're broadcasting both to YouTube and Twitch live. On both of these platforms, the average person that's doing politics is not in that spectrum of normalcy. They just aren't. And so you would get an impression, if you were to get your news from just social media, you would think that it was normal to either be like a far right reactionary who thinks that we should have an ethno state and kick out everybody who's not white, or that it's normal to think that we should execute all landlords. Like that's the normal spectrum for them, because so many people out there like Vaush or Nick Fuentes. I know Nick Fuentes got banned from YouTube, but a lot of his cohorts, these people are out there saying stuff that's completely absurd to anybody normal. Yet they create this echo chamber here, and that's one of the reasons why I've got this channel here. And it's good to have people like you on who can see through the BS and see that that's just a bunch of fringe and cringe radicalization, right? So, but that's kind of a bit of a rant.
I won't
Yeah.
pretend that the lack of empathy in American politics is not an incredible problem, but it does not just cut one way.
Yeah.
I think that ultimately that lack of empathy, if anything, is going to kill this country in a way that is going to be grand and cataclysmic, is going to be that lack of empathy. But the way I see it, it's
For
not
sure.
in that, if you don't support Medicare for all, you're a genocide heir kind of type, any more than it is, well, if you don't care about my farm failing, then you're a goddamn communist kind. It had
Yeah.
the inability of people to hold a normal conversation between, what get termed left and right, depending on what you think of that particular designation in the United States, whether it's appropriate or not. The inability of people to hold those kind of conversations without calling for mass murder, typically, if it's coming from the right, they're probably talking about, I've found a lot of people who are talking about mass killings of immigrants coming over the border. You go into the left, it's usually landlords, billionaires, take your pick. And
Yeah.
the fact that we are moving toward this idea where your political alignment is who you want to put a bullet in, I think it's a very dangerous thing. I think it is going to be something that eventually is going to come to light. And the day it does
Yeah.
is a day that, the fighting in Charlottesville a couple of years ago, we are going to miss those days because it is going to look like a tailgate party compared to what will
Right.
happen in this country if we let that strain of politics continue.
And I had that question for you. It was originally going to be, in the order here later on in the interview, but this is a good time to go to that question instead. We've talked a little bit before about the idea that there could be a second civil war in the United States. You're kind of alluding to that right here, that there could be that divide, that partisanship, that radicalization, and most importantly, perhaps the removal of empathy from the disappearance of empathy from particular anybody under the age of 35 by and large, to spite whatever group, whatever buzzword group, the neocons, the boomers, whatever they don't like. Do you see that giving rise, that there would be a chance of that giving rise to potentially a civil war, and how do you see that might unfold, and what would be the battle lines, and what would be the main source of the conflict? Because of course in the original one it was over the South versus the North,
Mhm.
with respect to things such as the institution of slavery, right? What do you think would be the real flashpoint going forward into a dystopic sort of insurrection in the future?
I think the next one, assuming it happens, is going to be nowhere near as clear cut as the first one was. Because in the war that took place between 61 and 65, you had two generally clear cut people on one of two sides of a very divisive issue. And probably, if I'm being completely honest, one of America's greatest sins. But the next one is going to be nowhere near that clear cut in terms of either causes or in terms of how it gets fought. I think you're going to see a lot of people who are committed to one ideological faction or another. I think you will see a lot of. Okay, the way I guess I would put it is that the template for the next American Civil War is going to look a lot like Afghanistan between 1990 and 2001, where it is going to be dominated by militias, and you are going to have maybe some form of central government trying to hold everything together. But by and large, it is a war because the sense of law across the country essentially has become this feudalistic, dominated by the rule of the gun way of doing business. It may start clear cut. It may start with one state or several breaking away over some issue. It could be someplace in the South, say Georgia, the Carolinas, breaking away over contraception. It could be somewhere in the Pacific West talking about how they don't like the way the government has been handling healthcare policy or climate change or the like. It may very well start that clear cut. It may start less clear cut. It may be a whole bunch of threeper militias out in the woods of Idaho terrorizing local communities and
The
spiral from there.
Threepers. Oh man, those guys are so cringe, man. What is it, like American
Good.
Patriot 3%? That's the name of their group, 3%. Like
Mhm.
thinking, only 3% of Americans rose up against the British, therefore we're badasses. And it's like they're going to be the ones rising up against their own government. Like, you
Mhm.
know, I mean, you
And,
talk
and
about
it
the
doesn't
militias and
matter.
everything. Yeah.
The way I see it, it doesn't matter which way you ideologically align, whether you're left, right, center, far right, center left, center right. The only assurance that can be made in the instance of a new conflict in the United States is going to be a lot of suffering and a lot of dying. And the people
Mhm.
left and right, I mean, on the left, you get this talk about how, I mean, a lot of it is a very fringe element of the left who are a handful of, woke baristas who fantasize about themselves being at the front of cheering crowds of the guillotine. But at the same
No,
time,
it's so funny because like as Reese said about those people, when we kind of talked about this on an earlier stream with the Hawks, where we were talking about how the Bernie Bros and the Dirtbag left, how a lot of their rhetoric is basically, it's very similar to the free helicopter rides that the alt right wants to talk about. We were talking about, and Reese said, the one big difference is, they're not the bros for it. Like, at least in the case of the right wing and stuff, they got all the militias and all this. They could actually they wouldn't be able to defeat the U.S. Army, but they could cause a big amount of damage, and they could definitely kill quite a few leftists. But as far as these dirtbag lefties, like the Hassan Piker types, who they're basically soy boys. They weigh like 100 pounds. They sit there playing like Fortnite or whatever all day and all this sort of stuff. But then they talk about killing all the landlords and everything. But they like their Gucci swag, and they like their lattes at Starbucks and stuff, and they like being woke, and they all talk about different treatises on the revolution and all this stuff. At the end of the day, you're like what Reese was saying is like they're not the bros to pull off a revolution. They're not the bros to win. If that sort of thing happened in America, it would be the right that would prevail against the left if it came to an open conflict. Would you assess that to be the case, or do you think that it would be more than just the left versus right thing? Because of course, if it did, obviously the left owns fewer guns than the right. But
I would
guns
call that possibly the initial case. I think that early on, you could very well see clashes between left and right-wing militias in the streets of Portland or San Francisco or Charlottesville or any major city from sea to shining sea. But it will not stay that way anymore for a year. And once that first shot gets fired, there is no getting it back. You have all the left-wingers talking about how it's going to be a revolution for the good of the people. It's going to be for free healthcare. It's going to be for action on climate change. At the same time, you have a lot of right-wing people who just want to get rid of the left. Whichever way you cut it, there is no way where either of those two triggers gets pulled where it does not initiate a slippery slope into Somalia, Libya, Afghanistan style chaos. And that time there is going to be no one to look to bail you out. You cannot have the United States come and save our metaphorical Afghanistan, because the United States is the metaphorical Afghanistan. And no one is going to be able to clamp down on that. It will be the greatest geopolitical and humanitarian disaster in global history.
Yeah, you mentioned that nobody's going to be there to save America because America used to be the one doing that. There is a point to note though, is that if this did happen, you would have Russian private military contractors operating in America on the side of chaos agents within America. You would have the Chinese involved. You would have even the North Koreans potentially involved in that. You would have these powers that are anti-American seeking upon it and seeking to exacerbate the extent of it, just how in the Russian Civil War you had great powers from different sides funding different elements and stuff in it. In this case, you would have great powers where, regardless of whether they were funding the Antifa types, like I could see Communist China doing, or funding the alt-right, like I could see the Russians doing. Though, to be fair to the Russians, they're smarter than that. I think that Putin would offer assistance to the Antifa brigades, and he would offer assistance to the alt-right, because he doesn't care who wins. He just cares about destroying the American establishment and weakening America as a whole. So he really doesn't care if Sanders fans or Nick Fuentes fans prevail. He personally probably has more in common with Nick Fuentes on social issues, but he probably has more in common with Sanders on economics. So he doesn't care, right? He's a left-y type, ex-KGB agent who's deeply socially conservative. So he doesn't really care. He just hates America, hates Hillary Clinton, hates Joe Biden, hates Mitt Romney, anybody within the spectrum of normalcy. Hates Elizabeth Warren too, even though, we've talked about on this channel about how Elizabeth Warren would serve their interest in some ways. She's still, even though she's on the farther left side of it, she's still within that spectrum of normalcy. It's Bernie and beyond where you really get into the crazy land, and he would be supporting those crazy type elements. And because I know that people have said to me before that if this sort of thing did ever try to flare up, that the U.S. military and the U.S. government would be very quickly able to put it down. The problem is, and as you highlight there, is that it could get to a point of such social chaos and upheaval that the U.S. government might have a genuine hard time containing it. And
Mhm.
it wouldn't just be the US military as the only military involved, because once these other actors from abroad come in to stoke discord and to aid the militias, then it could be a lot harder for even a powerful government like the United States government to restore order. But what do you think about, though, the idea of America's government as being so overwhelmingly powerful that if it did get this bad, at least the U.S. government would be able to clamp down on it relatively quickly? Do you think that they would be able to do that,
I
or do you
think
think
it is
it would give way
very
to a
wishful
law?
thinking
Yeah,
because the United States has one of the greatest land areas in the world. And I mean, where I come from in the West, there is a lot of land area out here that would make great places to hide. And a lot of people like to talk about, you'll find a lot of the Threeper LARP militia crowd talking about, if Beto O'Rourke or if Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden never come for my guns, there's going to be a war. And inevitably, you will have someone more liberal minded, and I mean liberal in the American sense, down below them saying, if it ever comes to a war, you and your militia buddies are going to go head to head with the Hellfire missile, and you're not ever even going to see what killed you. And to them, I would direct attention towards the Taliban, who have radically less popular support than you would find for an uprising out here, who have much less land area to hide in, about as equally rugged terrain. And I think when those attacks, just hit and run sort of things, keep continuing across whatever region they're active in, you're going to have a lot of people turning to the federal government, even their sympathizers, and saying, well, why aren't you doing anything to help us? Why are you so ineffectual? And inevitably, one of two things happens. Either people lose faith in the ability of the United States to clamp down on the insurgency, or it will get a lot bloodier and you'll have a lot more people's friends and families coming home in boxes or just straight up never being found. Like I say, whichever way
right,
it goes, the United States will not survive its next civil conflict, at least not in the current form it has. And I think it is something that should be actively avoided at all costs for that exact reason.
right, right.
But
Well, no,
nonetheless, the surge
yeah,
in radicalism going left and right makes that ever harder because a lot of them see it as a way to, get rid of the dissidents for whichever utopia you think is going to happen. A lot of them see it as a
yeah,
way of settling scores that have existed for years. Hell, a lot of them just see it as a way of getting American imperialism, that great big boogeyman, out of the picture. And I guarantee you that's the way that Putin and Xi see it. I mean, Putin
yeah,
actively hopes for a second civil conflict in the United States because it would get us out of his business. You would no longer see American troops in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East or in Africa or anywhere, which would free up the Russian armed forces to recreate the Russian Empire. And out of that, inevitably, this is the funny part of it, is that the Russians and Chinese need us for very different reasons. The Russians need us because Vladimir Putin needs someone to pin all of Russia's problems on so that he can keep clinging to power, so that he can keep committing his own atrocities, both at home and abroad. If the US disappears, Russians have a whole lot less incentive to hand over their freedoms, especially younger Russians who admittedly tend to be a lot more radical in either the far left or far right variety, but they are not friendly to Putin. I mean, you take the example of Alexei
right,
Navalny. He is not US friendly. I mean,
yeah,
admittedly, he's neither a left or right wing radical, but you have a lot of people like Navalny who, as soon as the US is out of the way, are going to say, well, now what? Why are we doing anything for you? You're not doing anything for us anymore. You're sending our troops to Kazakhstan and to Syria and to Belarus and the Baltics and Poland to die to rebuild some empire that fell apart a century ago before it was reborn as the Soviet Union. What are you protecting us from? You're not protecting us from anything anymore. The Chinese, by a similar token, as much as we love to bash on the trade agreements we have with China, China relies on those trade agreements because if
Yeah.
America falls apart economically, which will happen in the event of a civil conflict, you're going to have American companies no longer able to sustain operations in China, which leads to a lot of unemployed Chinese citizens, which means China starts dissolving economically, which eventually means that in both cases, you're going to have massive opposition movements, and the multipolar world will have become briefly a unipolar world dominated by Russia and China before they fall off the edge of the planet, too.
Yeah, man.
If you don't
That's
see it as a
yeah.
really short-sighted play by the Eurasian axis, then I guess that's one silver lining.
Yeah, I mean that's the sort of thing that I mean you say, at all costs we have to prevent the disintegration of America because of course America is the vanguard of the liberal order,
Mhm.
and if America goes, so too will the West. That'll be the end of our civilization. And so for me, I personally believe that the big battle at stake currently is over the political culture, and that goes beyond just any sort of elections. That goes to a point of changing what's seen as edgy or cool or hip
Oh,
or
absolutely.
swaggy. I mean, back in the day,
Absolutely.
100 years ago, even 50 years ago, it wasn't seen as hip and swaggy to actively shill against your country on whatever media. Like you would be called a traitor, and it wouldn't be a compliment. And it wouldn't be a badge of honor. It would be the sort of thing that you would fight to the end of your life to clear your name of. Whereas now you got Hassan Piker out there on Twitch or whatever saying that America deserved 9/11 and he's proud of it basically and refuses to apologize and mitigates and
Mhm.
rationalizes his statements where he's celebrating the injurement of a U.S. service personnel. This sort of stuff. That was never a thing for any country. And unfortunately, that's a byproduct of having an enlightened society, of having an open society, is that we're more vulnerable than our enemies are because we allow freedom of speech. And so if you allow freedom of speech, you also therefore allow freedom of flag burning, that sort of stuff, which you would never have in Russia or China. You just get executed if you tried that there. But the problem is a democracy is what's worth fighting for, but it
Mhm.
is a weakness going into that battle. And so I believe that it's ever more important that to us, the hawkish community, that we recognize that the social media is the new platform that we need to be engaged on. And it is the case that a lot of these figures that were more reserved for traditional media have been moving out to Twitter and even on YouTube. But we really do need to step up our meme game. We got to step it up. It needs to be seen. Like we need to change the value of what's seen as ultimately something that's hip or swaggy, because it's not swaggy or cool to say that your own country, the country that's the most prosperous in the history of the world, that you should be ever grateful to be born in, is is the worst evil in history, and then it's bad for America to expand our influence in the world. I mean, again, I think it goes back to that lack of empathy that these people either know so little of the rest of the world or care so little for the rest of the world that they personally feel that them having to work for a job that pays like 30,000 or 50,000 a year instead of whatever Bill Gates has is like the worst atrocity in the world. And that the only way that they would support America is if they themselves were a billionaire, without realizing the fact that even the poorest of America are better off than the party bosses were in the Soviet Union, because those guys, even Khrushchev, who was like arguably the number two under Stalin, uh, he had to worry about getting killed each night. So, and he didn't have that much food, and he was one of the most powerful people in the country. And he even said in his own memoirs, I was better off working as a Ukrainian coal miner than I was as the party boss for all of Ukraine, because I had more food. I didn't have to worry about getting purged, and I had more free time and all this stuff. And you're like, these people, regardless of whether the left or right wins in that circumstance, the state that comes out of it will see the purging of most of those who supported it. One of my friends said, and I know it's an older quote, but he kind of introduced the line to me. He said, the only good thing about communism is that those who wanted it the most are going to be the first to die from it in the purges. And that's true. And that's
Mhm.
true. And, the silver lining to all this is that if that did happen, those militia guys would get purged in the Night of Long Knives, and the dear leader would take over. Nick Fuentes would go to a mass grave, all that sort of stuff. I mean, he's not winning that power struggle. He's
Mm-mm.
like, the whole meme with him is that he's Mexican and stuff. He wouldn't make it in the ethno state. And then, of course, on the left, you got these guys like Hassan Piker,
Mhm.
and they want a civil war really badly. They want a revolution really badly. Yet they would get purged so fast because, one, they're soy boys that have never like held a gun in their life. And sure, they might have photoshopped like an AK-47 into their social media or whatever, but they don't know how to use a firearm. And two, they're bourgeois, decadent, imperialist liberals by the standard of the party. I mean, Hassan wears all of his Gucci stuff. They would call him a kulak and have him executed. And
Yeah, you
so,
mean that
so it would
iPhone
be
X,
very,
$5,000 a month Brooklyn apartment and brand
it would be
new
a very
for
dark place.
2020 sitting out in the front yard aren't what the proletariat usually have. Color me shocked.
No, it's the sort of thing that, like, I've got one more question, and then we'll open
Mm.
it up to the question and answer. The other question that I had for you, and you kind of alluded to it here, but what do you think is the greatest threat facing the Western order currently? Do you think it's that sort of internal lack of empathy, which you mentioned is it would stoke a civil war, that would be the cause, or do you see it as the connivings of Moscow or Beijing, that sort of thing?
I see it as both because I see them as indivorceable. The domestic factor usually is sympathetic towards the likes of Moscow. Sometimes it's a consequence of being accused of being in their pocket so much they actually end up there. Sometimes it's through ideological alignment. Sometimes it's through being propped up on social media or wherever else. And I believe that the Eurasian axis of Russia, China, Iran, their respective allies and auxiliaries, use them as tools, and not even just those armed, LARP groups that like to go into the woods and blow up soda cans every other weekend. It's also the talking heads who can see no further than the liberals are creating all our problems, the conservatives are creating all our problems. It is every time you see someone complaining about how Trump or Clinton or Obama or Bush or Reagan or Truman or Roosevelt or Lincoln or Washington or God himself is solely responsible for every problem faced by the American people. Ultimately, I think that these two things play off each other because they have similar interests. You cannot have the internal division without an actual grassroots groundswell of disillusionment. But at the same time, you can also not have them become so insanely popular without someone else pushing them on. And I think at the same time, our unwillingness to engage the likes of Russia and China and the undemocratic, as I've referred to them, the Eurasian axis, the unwillingness to push back on them eventually means that eventually we will have nowhere else to go. We will have nowhere else to fall back to. So be it internal or external, the threat is not left, it's not right. It is that simple opposition to democracy, and it comes from both fronts.
Right.
And I
No,
think that
I
lack of
appreciate, yeah.
empathy that I was talking about is what spurs a lot of that. It is what spurs people to say, oh, don't worry about Iran. Don't worry about them getting nuclear weapons. I know they've talked about, wanting a whole new Holocaust in Israel, but don't worry about that. It's not our problem. And at the same time, you get them talking about, well, don't worry about Korea or Japan if North Korea ever decides to go toe-to-toe with them. It's not our problem. And you carry on that lack of empathy back home. It's, well, I don't really care that much that you're struggling with not being able to pay for your healthcare. Like, I'm not going to endorse M4A, but I won't pretend that the American healthcare system doesn't have its problems, but I digress. I don't
Yeah.
care that you are trying to flee from a war in your home country in Guatemala or Nicaragua or Venezuela. I don't care that you're fleeing poor economic conditions. I don't care about any problem you might face, because what about my problems? What about my inability to pay my rent? What about my farm failing? What about any given issue? And I think that those anti-democratic actors love to seize on that anger and use it as a weapon against us.
Yeah. No, I think, it's so ironic because those people who say, it's not our problem, you know, it's not your problem until it is your problem. They're the people
Mhm.
that would bring about the greatest problem for America when they're on the borders, when they're inside. I mean, fascist Russia is not going to be content with just having hegemony over Eurasia. Once that's established, if America just drops the ball and says, "Oh, we're leaving. We got a new government right now. We're going to be fascist, nationalist, ethno status. You can have the rest of the world, but don't take us." Well, when they've got troops on the Canadian border, which is now a colony of theirs, and they've got troops in Mexico, which is now a colony of theirs, you can still say, well, that's their sphere of influence, bro, but this is ours. But
Mhm.
when they do decide to then come in, now they've got like 35 million troops on their side because they've got almost all the world, and they've got populations in India and stuff as their colonies. And now you've got, like, by that point, maybe 450 million people in America. What are you going to do? I mean, they could conscript your entire population to be soldiers in like a week, and that's it. Like, it is your problem at that point. Yet these people, they just want to stick their heads in the sand and say, me, me, me. All I care about is me. And it's so
Well, let me
ironic because
tell you,
if you
even
did
if
care about
you,
yourself, if you did care about yourself, you would want to live in a world that had the prosperity where even if you're born poor, you're still richer than you would be in that world or almost anywhere else, or in any alternative that they want. Or you say, uh I don't, democracy, it's degenerate or whatever. I want us to go to like some fascist state because that would be better. And of course, all these people that say that, they all imagine themselves that they would be the Fuhrer. They all imagine that
Mhm.
they would be the Stalin figure. And you're like, there can only be one great leader. Like, oh, there's only going to be one winner coming out of that. There may be a million of these guys on 4chan that are complaining about that, how they can't get laid, so they say, let's do away with the West and go to a Nazi system. But almost all of them are going to get purged in the night of long knives, however many times that happens. Only one of
Mhm.
them is going to become the Fuhrer. And I've talked about this in private conversations before with people, but I'll have to do a video on this. This is kind of a outside the box way of thinking, but if we did go to one of those types of systems, I have news for all these disenfranchised basement incels, whether they're on the left or the right. You know who would actually win if we did go to a Nazi type system or a Stalin type system, who would become the great leader? It would be somebody like Jeff Bezos or somebody like a Donald Trump type figure. It would be somebody who's already won in this system, because it's very easy to succeed in Western capitalism. Everybody can win at the same time. It's not a zero sum game. Whereas like a Nazi system, it's zero sum. The great leader gets everything. Everybody else works for the great leader. Here, there's not a finite number of resources to go around. You can make your own success and whatnot, like a Jeff Bezos did. He's already won in an easy system to win. And I believe that if we did go to that hierarchical, entrenched socialist or national socialist system that these guys want because they can't get laid, instead of them not getting laid in this system, now they're either dead or they're not getting laid because someone like Jeff Bezos has become the great leader, and now he's got whatever, like a pleasure squad of like 10,000 women in his harem or whatever. Like, in other words, it would be the capitalist vulture capitalists in this system that would probably also win in that system. It would be these losers who say that we should just do away with our whole country because I'm losing right now. They wouldn't be winning in that system either. They would also be losing in that system, and they don't realize it. And I think that if we could get that pill out there, a lot of people would look at a civil war the same way that I think the Russian people would, where the Russian people, by and large, say life sucks right now, but it could always get worse. So we're going to support Putin. Whereas these alt-right people and stuff, they say, yeah, life sucks right now, so let's do a revolution. It can get better. Like they should probably learn something from the people who've been through a lot, like the Russians. Now, I think it's a problem that people in Russia are so traumatized from 1,000 years of tyranny that they say, well, I hate Putin, but I'm going to support him and vote for him because the alternative could be chaos. It's like, I don't like that. But the alt-right and the left here, the dirtbag left here, they're so dumb. They don't even realize from the populations that have been through that yeah, things will get worse for you if you step outside the bounds of the rule of law and say, I'm losing now. And instead of trying to win within this system or try to have some modicum of success in this system, I'm just going to go to the Lord of the Flies and hope to be the dear leader and purge everybody else. It's like, well, if you do that, there's a higher chance that you're going to wind up the route of Zinoviev and Kamenev and Bukharin and Trotsky, that you are going to be that Stalin type figure. Because I put money on it that if we went to that system, Jeff Bezos would probably be the Stalin. And you say, but he won in the last system. The whole point was so that we could win this time. It's like, yeah, he knew how to win in an easy system. You didn't. So you think you're going to know how to win in a hard system? And the Lord of the Flies, it's those who are successful right now that would also come out on top. That's how social Darwinism and hierarchies work. And at least the alt-right claims to care about hierarchies or whatever, but of course they lack the empathy and the foresight to realize that they wouldn't be on the top of the hierarchy, right? But that's kind of a longer sort of rant from me to kind of close that out there. But I do want to give you the opportunity now to like give your sort of final remarks before we go to the Q&A and kind of let people know where they can follow you and your work, because I know you're on Twitter, right?
Yeah, at present, about the only two places, or actually the only place really that you can find me is on Twitter under the handle Deseret Patriot. I'm not particularly active, but I do figure it's a good way to keep a finger on the pulse, if you will. In the meantime, I guess I really don't have a whole lot to say other than that democracy is worth fighting for, the United States is worth fighting for, and it takes a whole lot of effort to keep that alive and to make it thrive. Because the alternative to that is a lot of suffering and tyranny and chaos. You can either fight like hell to make what you've got work, or you can give in and just embrace that nothing ever will.
Yeah. Oh, man. So we're going to go to the chat now. If anybody here has any questions for Elias, particularly focused on, foreign policy, international relations, but any other sort of political questions too, feel free to post them in the chat now and we will go to them. I currently am only really able to see comments from YouTube here. The Twitch channel is pretty new, but it doesn't give me the option to see comments going on there. But we do have an active chat in YouTube, and we do have 15 viewers from YouTube currently. So thanks for being with us tonight. There are millions of other channels out there. You choose to be with us. That's great. Appreciate it. But yeah, let's see. I'm just going to go through the chat a little bit here and see if anybody brought up any sort of stuff. Let's see. Yeah, we had some comments saying how if Trump postpones or cancels the election in November, that could lead to a civil war. Do you see that as something that's within the realm of possibility? Because I know I do, given the pandemic right now, that he could use that as a justification.
Well, theoretically, if he had the authority to, absolutely, I think it would be a flashpoint. As it stands, American elections are considered something so incredibly sacred by our legal system that, I mean, the exact date is enshrined in the Constitution. I think it's it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of even numbered years. So
Right.
something that is that specifically enumerated is, if you'll pardon my blue language a little bit, an absolute thou shalt not fuck with this event. So I think if he wanted
Right.
to, I think if he had the authority to, it would absolutely be a flashpoint for some sort of at least massive civil upheaval. Um, I think that even rhetoric of it could trigger mass protests. But as it stands right now, he does not have the authority to cancel elections. Under our current system, he cannot have the authority to cancel elections. He will never get it through Congress or the courts. So, no, I do not think that Trump will make any effort to cancel American elections or that it will be a flashpoint at any point in the future, in the immediate future, that is.
Gotcha. We have a question here from FKJMS 73. He asks, "What do you think is the future of the Republican Party post Trump?"
Oh, Lord, if that isn't the question of the decade. See, being a member of that party and kind of a rebel member of that party, I do not align with the Republican Party on a lot of things. But given the state I live in Utah. It is very much a one party state. It's one of the better ways to have a voice in local and state level politics. That being said, the future of the Republican Party is so incredibly muddy in the post Trump era. I think that the way it's going to shake out finally is that you are going to have a massive schism in the party. You are going to have the Trumpist element, which is going to be a pretty broad coalition if we're talking in terms of the age and ideological thing, who is going to encompass everyone from Charlie Kirk to Nick Fuentes up to, Mitch McConnell. I think it is going to that far right element, that partisan right element, is going to stay strong. Excuse me, in American politics, particularly the Republican Party, for at least the next decade or so. But nonetheless, I think you're going to get a lot of Republican rebels disillusioned and disaffected by Trump's not only his ideological radicalism, but his frankly inane ways of doing business that are a lot of the time centered around his own personal ego, that you will see a permanent divide in the party. And whether it actually separates into two completely separate parties is, I don't think, the most plausible thing, but I wouldn't completely discount the possibility. I think if you could see something similar happen with the Democrats in this sort of progressive versus, I hate to use the word, establishment sort of idea, but as it stands right now, that's what I think is the most possible. Is that you will at the very least see a massive internal schism in the party that will not be healed for at minimum the next decade.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. I think, for me, I've talked about before that I think that the neoconservative side, that the more hawkish side will eventually take over post Trump. But you're right that there's going to be that undercurrent there, that Steve Bannon, that paleoconservative element that's going to push for a break from what was the mainstream of the Republican Party, from Reagan to George W. Bush and whatnot. But I'm going to go to the next question here. This is from Alex Ratzloff. He asks, this is directed at Elias. What do you think will happen in Afghanistan next?
Personally, if Afghanistan keeps going the way it's been going, I think that what you're going to see happen is a lot like what happened in Iraq in 2011, because it is generally agreed on both sides of the American political divide, Republican and Democrat alike, that the American combat mission in Afghanistan needs to end. That's personally a position that I don't share. If anything, the Taliban is surging, and there needs to be a continued American presence until such time as the Taliban and the Islamist insurgency in the country is a non-factor. I think that you will have the Taliban step up their attacks. I think what could very well happen is going to be something not only like Iraq, but as a matter of fact, what happened in Vietnam in 1974 and 75. I think as soon as the United States and NATO end their combat mission and pull out, I think you're going to see the Islamist insurgency step up their attacks, step up their campaign, to a point where they will completely kick the legs out from under the Afghan government, because they don't see the Afghan government as a legitimate government. I mean, we've
Right.
had what they've called a peace process. It's not a peace process. It's a get America out of Afghanistan process, which will not lead to peace, going on since the very late stage of the Bush administration. And since they were first toppled in 2001, in the past 2 decades, they have never once demonstrated themselves willing to come to terms with the legitimate Afghan government. They have never once actually been able to commit and, I should say, physically commit to an actual reduction in violence. They have never once recognized, I think I said this already, the Afghan legitimate government is legitimate, and they never will.
Yeah.
They will continue either with this escalating campaign of theirs until either Afghanistan collapses completely and you have no one in charge, the Afghan national government is able to reasonably push back on them. I don't think that's going to happen without massive American and Western support. Or you have a new IEA, a new Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and you are exactly, back to where you were on September 10th, 2001.
Right. Right. I mean, it's such a mess. I mean, because the Taliban controlled about 70% of Afghanistan back then, and
Mhm.
now they control about 13%. And right near, with victory in sight, the Trump administration wants to pull out. It is in that sense similar to Vietnam, where the lesson should be that you need to see these things through to their conclusion. You can't just go in and then elect somebody else and then pull out and expect there to somehow be a victory out of that. It's just, you need to stay the course, regardless of whether there's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. There should be that understanding that you don't mess with previous engagements until victory is secured. And that's my view on it, at least. But we have another comment here that asks, do you think we have to intervene in Mexico to deal with the cartels?
Oh, this is always a complicated question now, isn't it? The situation in Mexico is one that is kind of unique to the Americas, in that you have a state in a what is effectively a step away from being a full-fledged civil war, right next to a massive power with the capability to deal with it. But the cartels, since their inception, have always been very slippery, and it has been very hard to make a hit on them work. Like, it's been hard to make anything stick against the cartels for anything longer than, I think, like a year at a time, because through their brutality, they are good at preying on the desperate, and they keep recruiting a lot of, especially younger kids who may have no other source of income, into the cartels as smugglers or as enforcers, and there is no way out of that. But putting aside that history lesson, I think that the United States needs to step up its support to Mexico. I think we need to allow them more access to our intelligence assets. I think we need to supplement their forces if they'll permit it. But I think that sending American troops into Mexico as part of a full-fledged invasion would be a mistake. Mexico has always been, from independence onward, it has always been impossible to control. You will never have an outside power be able to completely dominate Mexico without one hell of an insurgency. But nonetheless, the United States absolutely needs to support the Mexican effort to bring the cartels down. Their brutality is something that cannot be permitted to survive. That said, a full-fledged American invasion of Mexico, a full American intervention, is going to turn a lot of people against us more than for us. And I think you will actually see the cartels in the aftermath of what will become a war, a second Mexican war. You will see a lot more people go to them out of desperation, because that's what the cartels prey on, is desperation, be it economic, political, social.
Right.
They love the desperate as assets. And so I think that by sending American forces in, even if you manage to crack down on the cartels militarily, you're going to see a lot of collateral damage that leads to a lot more people joining them, either out of, well, it's the only job I can find in town, or you may have cartel enforcers coming to drag more kids off like they do to join the cartel itself, willingly or unwillingly.
Hmm.
So I think that sending American forces to, I know that this isn't something that typically gets pushed on this channel, but to lead from behind in Mexico and to give them support where it's appropriate and where they need it is much better than to say that Mexico can't handle it at all and that it's completely in our hands now. Absolutely, I think that the cartels need to be dealt with militarily, but it needs to be Mexican forces on the front line before it's American forces, as part of that whole struggle for legitimacy that the Mexican government has been embattled in for a long time.
Right. One thing that I think would be good for America and for the Western states as a whole to pursue would be to do something analogous to the Marshall Plan in these countries to basically build up their economies and whatnot, where you send basically foreign aid, but specifically to businesses and whatnot over there to assist them in developing the local economies and whatnot. The trouble is a lot of those systems are deeply corrupt in a way that Western Europe wasn't back then, and a lot of that is due to the cartel oligopolies that are in place there. And for me personally, I'm not sure how I feel about that, because I think that it's the sort of thing that if you do offer a lot of assistance financially, for example, most of that is going to get siphoned by the cartels, because they oftentimes will control the police force or the government officials or the businesses, and it's a really tough, and as you say, it's a situation that's really particular to the Americas in that sense. I'm not sure how whether or not I would support going about that leading from behind approach, or say, I think it's appropriate to have actual military troops on the ground there. I'm not sure on that. That's something that like I would need to do more research on. But definitely, I appreciate your response in that respect. We're going to go to the next question. This is Doctor. I know people were saying the other day that his name is pronounced Zayas. Doctor Zayas. He says, Superpower Broadcasting, you guys talked about finding new trade partners in Asia and pulling investment out of China. But do you think it's even possible to fully cut those ties at this point?
Honestly, to be completely truthful, I don't. I think that China has become so entrenched in the global economy that you cannot ever fully divest from them for purely practical reasons. But that does not mean that you have to start looking for alternatives, because allowing your economic industrial base to be dominated by an adversarial and non-transparent foreign power in that sense. I'm not saying that the foreign power part is the wrong part, but the anti-democratic and the non-transparent part absolutely are. And the adversarial part, excuse me. Because it allows China a stranglehold, whether they choose to use it or not. And I think we're seeing the repercussions of that partially brought out by COVID-19. When China goes down, the whole world goes down. So to completely tie yourself to China is irresponsible. No, I don't think you can fully divest from them, nor do I recommend it. But to allow them that unilateral dominance, that stranglehold, is frankly irresponsible.
Yeah. The next question that we have here comes from Anthony Avistubison in the chat on YouTube. He asked, "What is your position on Turkey?"
My position on Turkey is one that is a little more straightforward, and that is cutting cooperation with the Erdogan regime. They have proven themselves to be anti-democratic. They are hardly our allies at this point. The only reason we're keeping them around is for two particular strategic areas. We need the quick reaction forces that come out of Incirlik Air Base and control of the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits to keep the Russian Black Sea Fleet bottled up. Beyond that, there is no reason for cooperation with the Republic of Turkey. And I think that if things eventually come to a head between the United States and Russia in a very dramatic way, I think that we could not count on Turkey to be our ally. Because even in the past, what is it now, 4 years in the aftermath of the coup attempted by, what was that guy's name? Was it Gulen? I think that was it.
Erdogan, or oh no, the coup was blamed on Gulen. Yeah,
Yeah. So in the aftermath of the coup by his sympathizers, or I mean, he probably didn't orchestrate it, but there is no denying he was sympathetic. The likes of Gulen would be a much more, uh, they'd be a much better ally to us than the Erdogan regime ever could hope to be. The Erdogan regime is basically in Russia's back pocket at this point. They have proven themselves to be friendly towards Russia, both in the ideological sense, they're similarly aligned, that same strain of general authoritarianism, but at the same time, they are also geopolitically semi-allied with Russia. It's a very complicated relationship. I mean, for example, you take Syria, one of the big flashpoints now. Turkey, since the war began in 2011, has been bitterly opposed to the Assad regime. And Russia, since even longer, has been one of the Assad regime's closest allies. And it is
yeah.
that exact unreliability, that uncertainty, that means we cannot count on them if things ever go hot.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I know that there's no way to like formally kick a country out of NATO, but it's a total mess. And I think that, any sort of means to get Erdogan out, I'm not saying invade Turkey, but there should be serious support offered to the opposition there.
Mhm.
I hope to see, a U.S. led or instigated or Western instigated coup try to take him out of power again, because Erdogan is the sort of person that if he is allowed to have the reins of power over there for more years, he's going to lead Turkey in a more formal and official sense towards the Eurasianist Union, towards the Duginist idea. And
Mhm.
I mean, he's already opting to purchase Russian hardware over American. It's the sort of stuff that you can't have a NATO country that you're selling hardware to, and then they're also buying aircraft and stuff from the Russians. You can't have NATO equipment going over there when they're
I think in
getting
particular it
equipment.
was
They can be
S-400
reverse,
SAM
they
system. They
can
weren't buying
reverse
aircraft. They were
engineer.
nonetheless
Yeah,
buying
yeah,
military hardware.
yeah. They can reverse engineer on behalf of Moscow their anti-aircraft equipment to
Mhm.
work better and to fine tune them against American F-16s and against other American assets that they've been able to purchase.
Mhm.
And it's a complete problem. And what this shows is that there needs to be an addition to the NATO framework wherein you can exile countries until they come back to normalcy and whatnot, because Turkey would be a great partner against Assad and Iran and against Putin, but they have to be led by leadership that isn't sympathetic to Dugan and obviously the Ayatollah and whatnot, in terms of resisting the West as they see it. Erdogan's trying to take Turkey into a staunchly Islamic direction. And it's the sort of thing that he can undo a lot of progress that's been made there. And if, as you say, if a war did break out between the West and Russia, Yeah, you're right. With it, it's kind of like a swing. It's kind of a wild card. You don't know on which side the 500,000 troops are going to be ordered to attack. Are they going to be fighting
Mhm.
against America? Or are they going to be fighting against the Russians? You don't really know that because, I mean, there was a time just a few years ago when Turkey shot down a Russian aircraft, and for all Putin's tough talk, he backed the hell down and he ran off into the woods. But
Yeah, weren't
now
they just shaking
there's
hands like
no
a
tough talk.
week after that happened too?
Yeah. Now there's no tough talk. Now it's just, oh, we need to get along and work with Russia, and we're buddies and brothers and all this stuff. And it's super cringy, and it's the sort of thing that's very unacceptable to allow to happen because Turkey is of course the second biggest army in NATO. And we shouldn't just say, oh, you're done, you're gone because you have a different government. We should say, this is unacceptable to
Mhm.
lose them. We have to pursue regime change there. I would opt for covert means, but Turkey is too valuable of an asset against the expansionist powers in Eurasia that it's more complicated than just say you're gone now, because I think it's just unacceptable that Erdogan be in power to begin with, whether as exiled or formerly part of NATO. He has to go. That's my view. But we're going to go to the next questions here because we have a number of questions from the chat, which is good to see here. We have, let's see, what else do we have? We have a question from Anthony Roberto. He asked, are you concerned about Hungary, given that Orban is pro-China and Russia, as well as anti-democratic?
Absolutely. I think that Hungary, given as far west as it is compared to the rest of what you could consider the front line between NATO and Russia, I think that that is an exceptionally dangerous position. Um, I think that if things ever come to a head and Orban goes all the way into the Putinist, Eurasianist camp, the West is going to have a massive exposed area in southern Poland, which will make things a lot easier on the Russians, assuming things ever, like I said, do go hot. I think that Orban's human rights abuses, particularly towards immigrants coming in, are especially concerning. And not just concerning, I think they're outright deplorable. The leadership in Hungary under Orban and Fidesz is something that the elements of the Western world willing to push back on Russia and their anti-democratic movement, their global movement, I think that there needs to be a lot of pressure put on Hungary by them. Because strictly being in NATO does not grant you an immunity and invulnerability from that basic responsibility. It's the same way I see Turkey, in that you have a NATO state which is exceptionally vulnerable to the influence of NATO's adversaries. And I wouldn't say that Hungary is more dangerous than Turkey. In fact, I think that Hungary is substantially less dangerous as a geopolitical adversary than Turkey is. But nonetheless, Viktor Orban, is a personality and a character that has no position being in any sort of conversation about defending NATO and democratic Europe from Russia and the Eurasian axis.
Yeah, I think that's another one of those cases where you should pursue covert means to remove Erdogan from or not Erdogan, and in this case Orban from power. I think it's unacceptable. I did a video very early on in this channel, and it was called "The Descent into Darkness," in which I talked about Orban, how when he was younger. Now, of course, if you're interested in finding this video, it's gone because a bunch of alt-right idiots came and reported it for, I guess, being offensive or whatnot, because it was dark themes and stuff, and YouTube took it down. But that video, I talk about how Orban started off as a prodigy of George Soros, actually. He was given a scholarship and whatnot to attend George Soros school. and he was originally an advocate as a young man. He was an advocate for the International Liberal Order, and then once he got into power, he became a fascist, Steve Bannonite type of grifter, and now he's gone in a direction where I feel that it's this just profound psychological contrarianism in him, despite his former patron, if you will, George Soros, that now all of his rhetoric is just George Soros bad, liberals bad, feminists bad, all this stuff. And
He
for
actively
whatever reason,
describes himself and his system of governance as illiberal. That's the
yeah,
exact word he uses. So,
I see Orban as essentially analogous. If anybody here has seen the Star Wars movies, for example, I see Orban as very much analogous to a Darth Vader type figure, where he's somebody who starts off as kind of, very interested in politics, kind of, how can we make things better and whatnot. And then he's turned by the emperor, in this case, Palpatine or Putin, into becoming an asset against the good side. And in this example, both Erdogan and Vader had deep psychological problems that a higher, figure in this case was able to play upon. And in that sense, I view Orban not so much as a threat, not so much as somebody who's anybody to take seriously. I see him as a petulant child who never got over his weak little contrarian phase, despite his former patron, for whatever reason, George Soros, who gave him everything and gave him all the opportunities, and now he lives rent free in his head. And I believe that for the rest of time, as long as Orban is alive, George Soros has a lot of money. He doesn't need this. I mean, it's not like it saves him much money, but he gets to live rent free in Orban's head every hour of every day. But he could afford to pay rent, but he doesn't have to, because Orban nonstop is just George Soros bad. I don't like George Soros. How can I spite George Soros? And it's like, dude, I get it. You got some disagreements. Like, yeah, you're upset because he basically was the one who was his initial patron and everything, and they had a falling out. And at the end of the day, when it comes to world history and politics, oftentimes you'll see that element of how these personal psychological fractures and ultimate sort of what's the term? But these peculiarities can seep through to the course of the nation. And it was Orban's personal psychological problems that have taken Hungary down a very, very dark path, and there isn't anything good coming out of that unless the West gets serious and says, he has to go by any means. He's out, because the path that he's taking Hungary down is a path in which, and I talk about this in that video, and I'll have to see if I still have the video on file and try re-uploading it, because a lot of Orban fans, I mean, my channel was small. I had like 17 subscribers, but they were pissed and they came after it and called me things like, a feminazi and all this stuff and everything for talking about how Orban is basically this deeply reactionary Vader type figure. But that descent into darkness in which they're going down, they are mid-course right now. It's going to get a lot worse for Hungary. And Russia is a mirage. Any sense of Russian prosperity or righteousness, or even in that sense, Orban talks a lot about the idea of Christian democracy and whatnot. This idea of the authoritarianism, but it's guided by a belief in Christ. Well, his master, Putin, presides over a country which not only has a 15% Muslim population, which is by far the highest in Europe, it dwarfs Germany and England and whatnot, which they always like to point out as being, multicultural is a bad thing or whatever. But only about 2% of Russians, 2 or 3% of Russians attend church once a month or more. They are a very, very nihilistic country. They're a very They're a very atheistic country in the sense of the legacy of the Soviet Union. Most Russians recognize the Russian Orthodox Church as a corrupt institution and don't bother showing up to attend their services. And yet these guys, the fans of Orban, the fans of Erdogan, the fans of Putin, the alt-righters in the West, see Putin as like somehow this leader of Christendom and all this, when meanwhile in America, 10 times the percentage attend church more often. But you could never call America, a more faithful country because they see America as degenerate and all this stuff. And so it's funny how they buy into the image of a mirage rather than try to play within democracy in the United States. As far as what I think is going to happen with Hungary going forward, though, I think what we're likely to see is that things are just kind of going to continue because the West lately hasn't shown the political will to care to try to set things right. We're just letting everything slip aside and go further down the descent into darkness. And I mean, that happened in World War II, in the run up to World War II. Could have intervened against the Nazis a lot sooner. People would have died, but it wouldn't have been as many as in World War II. I think if something big does break out between the US and Russia, and Hungary and Turkey side with Moscow against the West in an armed conflict, and tens of millions of people will die, historians after the Third World War is long settled will remark on how, many millions of lives could have been saved if America had taken a proactive approach to keep Turkey and Hungary from becoming assets of Russia, where Russia can feel more confident engaging in confrontations, Or I don't think that Russia would start that war because they know that they would still lose at the end of the day, but it lends themselves to get more belligerent and Brinksman-like to the point that a miscalculation would start that war. Because for me, and we'll get to the next question, but I think, even in that case where Turkey and Hungary are on the side of Russia, America still wins the Third World War. It's just the world will look very different after that, after the Russian and American nuclear arsenals have been exchanged, after there's been tactical nuclear warfare waged across Europe. I think the world will look very different. I think America still wins that, but I think a big percentage of both countries won't be around to see that. But that's my view there. And I think,
the way to prevent that is by having George Soros talk Viktor Orban's kids into having him kill Vladimir Putin.
I mean, there you go. There you go. I mean, it's the sort of stuff that it's kind of funny. I like, these personal quabbles, they really do define the course of history at the end of the day. As much as people can talk about, how, it's the people of countries or whatever that build all the equipment and everything. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But it's the leaders that call the shots at the end of the day. And the leaders also have egos and psychological dispositions. And it's the fractures in Orban's psychological dispositions that are sending a country of several million people down a very, very dark path. And unfortunately, they're not as powerful as Turkey, but Turkey is going down an analogous path. And these are things that most people in the West don't care to think about. And if you did ever bring it up, they'd say, that's just their business. Who are we to tell them not to do that? Do you really want to tell Hungary what to do? And it's like, no, it's not telling Hungary what to do. It's saving the Hungarian people from the dictator that's going to send them down a very dark course of history. It's saving the Turkish people from a little bitter old man who has usurped power and plundered. I mean, just on his own mansion, he built a swag palace. And for that swag palace, he spent $1.5 billion of their money. And he had imported Italian trees to line the gardens of the swag palace. And you're like, dude, you're in Turkey. You're also a Mediterranean country. Why couldn't you just get the Turkish trees? But no, these guys have egos. He wants to be able to say to his swag friends, to Xi and Putin when they come over and visit and play video games and stuff. He wants to say, hey, man, I didn't get these trees from the commoners, not from the losers I rule over. I got them from Italy. Like, it's just like with Kim Jong-il. He doesn't drink soju. He doesn't drink Korean liquor. he drinks cognac, he drinks Hennessy, he drinks all that stuff. It's like he doesn't drive a Korean made vehicle. North Korea makes their own vehicles. They're mostly ripoffs of like South Korean models and stuff. He doesn't drive in one of those limousines. He drives in a Mercedes Benz because he wants to impress the dignitaries that visit and say, "Hey, look, I've got a Mercedes too." And it's the same with Erdogan. It's like, I don't have any of this cheap Turkish stuff. It's like these leaders don't care about their own countries. They really don't. They only care about themselves, their own egos, impressing their buddies. And unfortunately, the American president right now, he wants to impress those guys too. Like, he feels more comfortable in a room with Putin and Xi and Orban and Erdogan than he does in a room with Trudeau and Merkel and Johnson. Because those guys were democratically elected, and that intimidates him because he still has insecurities over the fact that he lost the popular vote, right? So, but we're going to move on to the next question, and then we're going to wrap this up. It is running pretty late, but there's a lot of stuff in the chat here. I haven't been focused on it, but I just see this question here from Anthony Roberto. He asked, "What do you think about putting military bases in Taiwan?"
Do it. That's it. Just do it.
Just do it. Just do it. It's like those Nike shirts. It's like, just do it. No, dude, it's like we need to get like those Nike shirts, but like have it as like a dark blue NATO flag. Like, just do it. Just do it. And like with a hawk. Oh man. Like, I'm gonna be making the shirts.
We've already got military bases at our other Asian geopolitical allies in South Korea and Japan. I figure when COVID blows over, the democratic world needs to care a lot less about pissing off the Chinese after their conduct with the COVID outbreak. As much as they've downplayed it, as much as they've pretended it wasn't happening, as much as they've lied to their people and to the world. I think that it has just been the real cherry on the top of the CCP's lack of transparency that they've exhibited since election. It's, on one hand, it's an authoritarian hallmark, but nonetheless, it is an example of just how little the People's Republic of China, ignore the oxymorons in that sentence, can be trusted. And as such, we need to start giving actual support and abandoning this, I believe, 70-year-long tradition of sort of dancing around the fact that Taiwan remains independent, acknowledge them as the valuable ally and frontline asset that they are, and give them the support they deserve.
Yeah. Oh, man. No, we agree. We agree on that. Absolutely. You got to support Taiwan. I would have a carrier group permanently forward deployed to protect the strait there, because obviously the plan practices invading Taiwan. I don't think that would work out too well for them because, Republic of China has nowhere near the military that they do, but they have the advantage defending an island. My worry is that America, the neoliberals in America, would say, well, we have all this moneyed interest with the communists. Let's trade with them and say screw it to the democratic capitalists over in Taiwan. And it's a funny thing how there are people in America that really strongly believe in capitalism that are willing to sell out capitalist allies to communists to make a quick buck. That's how capitalist they are. I'm not that capitalist. I put morals over money. That's why I'm the liberal neocon. I'm not a neoliberal, but it's like a reset about Tulsi Gabbard, Tanky Tulsi, because she always talks about the neocons and neolibs as like they're a unit. And he said, Tulsi must think that the prefix neo just means pro-war. like think about it, because she always says the neocons and neolibs. She has no idea what she's talking about, right? I mean, it's just, we had a good interview here. And we should probably wrap this up. We're over the 2-hour mark, but thanks for coming on, Elias. And like I gotta be up early for work, but thank you for coming on. And be great to have you on the channel again in the future. You're welcome back on, and it's always good to talk with you. We got some really good memes going. You know, like over the last year and a half, I mean, we've had a lot of dank memes, man. So, you know, but thanks for coming on and
Yes.
have a good night. And thank you to the audience for being with
All
us.
right.
Have a good night, everybody.
And you, sir. Thank you.